Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Street Tales. This one's going to be a little different. I am going to be solo. We're going to be digging into the cost of crime. It's something that's not talked about a lot, especially in law enforcement academies, any training I've ever had. And the research on it's very limited. Matter of fact, the most up-to-date research I was able to locate was from 2007, 2008. So these numbers are going to be outdated and probably a lot lower, but at least it gives an idea of what we're trying to get into and conversations we should be having. I wanted to also just address a couple things, the audio and the editing from previous episodes. I appreciate everyone who continues to listen. I'm kind of learning by doing. I appreciate you. I continue to dig into this, and I take it very seriously. So I appreciate your time, appreciate your support. As we get into this, I just want to also put out there, this is not an indictment of the men and women in law enforcement or the men and women who are prosecutors or defense attorneys. This is just the criminal system as it is in the U.S., and I want to dig into it. It's, again, something that you kind of get bits and pieces, especially in the news. Different states do different things, and people get in an uproar, but it's something to think about. I don't necessarily have all the solutions. I have my opinions on here, and I'm hoping to just generate a conversation. So getting into it, I'm going to be I use the NIH website, because again, that's the most recent statistics I found, unless somebody wants to message me and let me know that there's something more up to date. But in 2007, 23 million criminal offenses were committed, resulting in approximately $15 billion in economic losses to the victims and $179 billion in government expenditures. That includes police protection, the judicial process, legal activities, things of that nature, and corrections. So what I'm going to start with is the individual crimes and how those break down. There's a lot of crimes that were not on here. These are just major categories, and I wanted to talk about them. So starting off is murder, and again, this is rough numbers. Each murder approximately costs the overall total $8,982,000. And again, for those who are new to criminal justice, murder is when one human being kills another human being. So this has nothing to do with traffic crashes, traffic fatalities, or anything like that. The next one is rape and sexual assault. Each incident of rape and sexual assault, this is the way they broke it down, where an arrest is made, is approximately $240,000 per incident. And again, sexual assault, rape is forced sexual intercourse. I'm going to highlight under each one what I felt was missing. Missing from this research was child porn investigations, which has exploded across the U.S., especially since 2007. I know that there's a mandate for every federal law enforcement agency to investigate allegations of child porn, as well as most, if not all, local law enforcement agencies have some sort of task force or are part of some task force. There's also a weird push on the defense side to be lenient to first-time offenders who are accused or arrested and convicted, let's phrase it that way, of child porn. They don't want to have them labeled as sexual offenders on the sexual offender watch list, where you have to go and tell everybody that you're a sexual offender. You're also restricted from living in certain areas, can't be by schools, churches. It's a restriction that is pretty rough. But again, if you're engaging in sexual assaults or child porn, I don't see why we shouldn't be putting you on those watch lists. The next one is going to be aggravated assault. Again, it's specified as aggravated assault. This costs about $107,000 per incident. Aggravated assault is any attack on another person, regardless of injury, with a weapon. So again, it doesn't break down the fights or the one-on-one hand-to-hand combat that people engage in, so it left that out. The next one is robbery, which is about $42,000 per incident. And robbery is the completed theft or attempted theft of an actual individual. So it gets theft and larceny is the next category, but specifically robbery is where one person takes something from another person, whether just by force or with a weapon, things of that nature. digging into larceny and theft. It's about $3,500 per incident. And that's what most people think of as theft, where somebody's stealing something from a retail theft or steal something out of somebody's car, things like that. That's what theft is. So there's a large amount of thefts that go on in every agency, every state, every city, everywhere. The next one is arson, which is $21,000 per incident. And again, this one is not updated, but it's basically where you burn down somebody's property. And this doesn't take into account the 2020 riots, which caused over $1 billion in damages to the U.S. government. So again, doesn't even talk about how much it cost the victims that had their businesses, vehicles, houses, whatever burned down. The next one is motor vehicle theft, which is about $10,000 per incident. And again, this is when somebody actually is arrested. And that is the stealing somebody else's vehicle. Burglary is $6,000 per arrest or investigation. It's the unlawful forcible entry or attempted entry into a residence, usually involving theft. Doesn't always have to be. There's a lot of false reporting. It doesn't get into the domestic stuff where somebody gets kicked out or moves out, and then they want to report that something's missing. And actually, the entire research doesn't even go into domestics, which I think tie up a lot of law enforcement officers' times, local law enforcement officers' time. Then we get into some what we call white-collar crime. That's embezzlement, and that's the unlawful misappropriation for profit of money from somebody's business. That's about $5,000 per incident. Fraud is the intentional perversion of truth for the purpose of inducing another person or entity to part with something of value. That's again about $5,000 per incident. This research does not include the PPE loan fraud, the COVID relief fraud, or all of the online scams, telephone scams, where people want to call you and say, hey, you owe the government money. If you don't give us money, then we're going to come arrest you, which typically targets the elderly. And there is a large-scale push from state-sponsored other countries to do that, to defraud Americans. Speaking from experience, I know there's almost like a corporate setting in West Africa, Eastern European countries, Russia, China, where people check in, they scan in with a name badge, they go sit at a computer, and their job is to defraud Americans. And so I don't even think we know how much money was lost during the COVID relief fraud. Last time I checked into it, it was almost $6 billion had been shipped overseas from people doing these types of frauds. Stolen property is about $8,000, and that's basically anybody who, once the property is stolen, vehicles, electronics, whatever, then tries to travel across state lines, sell it, whatever that is. There was when I was with Hillsborough County, we were always looking out for what we called felony row actors who were huge in stealing vehicles and vehicle parts. And then they would use the I-95 corridor to not only do the stealing, but also to get rid of the stolen merchandise. And the next one is forgery and counterfeiting, which costs about $5,000, again, per incident. And that is the unauthorized altering, copying, or imitation of an article with the intent to deceive or defraud by passing of the copy as the original. Most people think of this as counterfeit currency, but there's counterfeit checks, there's counterfeit high-end retail bags, clothing, things of that nature. So this is something that's it's a wide array of things that can be forged. Funny enough, the U.S. Secret Service, a lot of people don't know this, was originally created to combat counterfeiting of U.S. currency. At the time, it was Abraham Lincoln. It was the last thing he put into service for the United States. He created it the day before he was assassinated. So there wasn't presidential protection back then, but the Secret Service was supposed to go after it because at the time, 70% of all U.S. currency was counterfeit. And so, again, down the line, Secret Service has grown into protecting president, vice president, and a bunch of other individuals. And so that double duty, so to speak, you see the investigating a forgery of currency as being minimized, so to speak, considering that the protection of our president, vice president, probably a little more important. And then last but not least on the research paper is vandalism. And again, these are 2007 numbers. It was about $5,000 per incident. And that's the willful destruction or damage of any real or personal property. Again, this doesn't take into account all the riots from 2020 and all the riots since then and the amount of destruction that was caused by vandalism. I do believe that totally these costs are much higher now as of 2024. I've talked about the riots in 2020, but also the overall lack of reporting from larger cities, New York, California, Illinois, etc. They just stopped reporting these large-scale crimes to the FBI, which is where a lot of these figures get pulled from. With that being said, there's also a massive push, and I experienced some of it when I was with local law enforcement, to recode criminal reports. So the example that I'll pull from is if somebody kicks in your door, steals your TV, and leaves, that's a felony. That's a burglary, and they stole something from you. So you will arrest that individual for felony burglary, but you would code the report as a misdemeanor trespass and misdemeanor theft. Take it as you want, but again, I believe that a lot of that is being utilized to show a reduction in Part 1 crimes or violent crimes or felony crimes. It's not accurate, and I don't necessarily agree with it. When they talk about the cost to government in the research paper, which is mostly what the research focused on, because it's something that you can kind of monetize, you can put a cost to it, was the policing cost, prosecution and defense costs, and then the jail costs. It's hard to put a dollar on somebody who's been victimized by any one of these crimes, considering that the mental health costs, the cost of your own property or your person, it's hard to put a dollar on that. So I think it leaves a lot of that out. So with that being said, it makes us think, or it made me think, how do we combat this type of cost and become more efficient in the way that we enforce our laws in the United States? And I'm going to first start by looking at the prison system. And there's some baseline nexus for how other countries combat criminality and how they use their correction facilities. Number one on the list is Germany and the Netherlands. These countries have a lower incarceration rates than the U.S., and they focus pretty much on resocialization and rehabilitation. They use incarceration less frequently and for shorter periods of time, and instead rely on fines and community-based sentences. Again, I think this is for lower-level crimes and misdemeanors, things like that. The mentality that Germany and the Netherlands is different, whereas the United States is more punitive. They want to punish for the crime. And again, I don't necessarily have all the right answers for this, but you can't have all carrot, meaning you can't be super lenient like they are in California. Everyone's seen that on the news where they're decriminalizing theft pretty much. And so it's just wanton theft, open air drug use. I've seen it with my own eyes, the homeless camps, people setting up on sidewalks. And again, this isn't to get political in the sense that it's something that the goal of law enforcement should be to protect the citizens of the U.S., but shrink that down, communities, counties, and states. And you can't just have wanton criminality going on everywhere, impacting people who law-abiding citizens. But at the other end of the spectrum, you can't have all stick. You can't have all punishment every time. Texas is an example that's used a lot, and I'm not trying to diminish or say anything bad about California or Texas. I think everybody's trying to figure it out in their own way. But Texas, everything is pretty much punished to the fullest extent of the law, which again increases violence, and which then leads to overall cost to the state, which then is obviously pushed forward onto the taxpayers. So there needs to be some sort of a balance. I know, for example, Amsterdam was an example that was proposed as a good balance. They have pretty much legalized almost everything, drug-wise, prostitution, but they have zones where you can do those drugs or engage in prostitution. And if you step outside or you try to engage in those activities outside of those zones, then you're going to get met with the fullest extent of the law. So they're giving you the carrot by allowing you the freedom to choose what you want to do. But then if you step outside those lines and you go into communities where they don't want to have anything to do with that, then they will punish that individual. So these are just some examples. Again, this is just more food for thought. I'm trying to propose thoughts and get people thinking and having the conversation because, again, like I said, it's not something talked about widely. And, again, we haven't done research since 2007. Another example I had was Norway, which is a small community-based correctional facility. Again, these countries have much smaller populations than the U.S., and they're not typically as multicultural as the U.S., so there's a lot of things that kind of go into these structures. But Norwegian prisons focus on rehabilitation and reintegration into society, and prisoners have access to musical instruments, DVDs, video games, things like that, recreational use. They offer them a lot more freedom. They classes. They want the criminal actors to basically have the ability to learn and recover in a low stress environment before they can be allowed back into society. Now, Russia is very interesting in the way that they've structured their criminal system. Again, not saying that this is the best way to do it. I'm just focusing on the criminal aspect and the correction side. So Russia uses a large number of penal colonies where inmates live in barracks instead of cells, broken down into open prison settlements where inmates live in settlements and can live with family members. Then they have the next one up, which is penal colonies which these penal colonies are located in regions rich in natural resources or are highly industrialized. So their punishment is to go mine natural resources or to work in these industrialized settings. And then the next tier up, so these are the most heinous criminals, murderers, rapists, things of that nature. So they are kept permanently locked down in cells which hold 5 to 30 people. And again, these are for the people who have committed the gravest of crimes or were referred from penal colonies because whoever was in the penal colony perpetrated a lot of rule violations. And so then they would get bumped up into the prisons. So when we think about the restructuring of the American prison system and how we would overhaul the justice system as a whole, things that have been talked about and tried in different states would be like low-level crimes, misdemeanors. You would focus more on rehabilitation, trade schools, possibly living in some sort of prison settlement, penal colony, however you want to phrase it. But that's where, in the U.S., if we were to try this, that's where most of the government resources money would be focused on that type of incarceration. This way you could have a targeted area for mental health services, education, drug rehab programs like AA meetings, drug counseling. You could also have these areas in remote settings. I know Dave was on a previous episode where he talked about geographical rehabilitation, basically getting out of the area where they had the most exposure to whatever it was, drugs, criminality, their friends, or whoever it was that was encouraging the bad behavior. You could also focus on physical fitness, nutrition, and access to healthcare, dental care, whatever it is they need. With the overall thought process being sometimes people feel like they have no way out and they have to engage these criminal activities or drug use as a way to self-medicate. And this would give them the ability to, one, remove themselves, gain education, get fit, understand proper nutrition, and be able to take care of themselves, which could then slowly reintroduce them back into society with this new skill sets and this new, with their healthcare kind of addressed. I mean, people listen to Joe Rogan and all these other podcasts about getting healthy and all the health benefits and the mental benefits that come from it. This could help reduce recidivism, which means they go back to a life of crime, or reduce going back into drug use. Also, we need to figure out a way to reduce the impact of some of our more devastating misdemeanors, like a DUI. I know every state's a little different, but for the most part, if you get arrested for a DUI, you're a young kid, you get caught drunk driving. I'm not especially today's day and age, 2024, there's Uber, there's cabs, there's Lyft, there's all kinds of ways for you to get back home, public transportation, whatever it is you need, so you do not have to drive drunk. But you get caught driving drunk, that stays on your criminal record for, in a lot of states, for life, or I think it's like 99 years, which is, that's life, which could then hinder you from getting, jobs in the government, law enforcement, CDL licenses, things like that. So getting a DUI when you're, 20, 21, 22 could basically limit you for the rest of your life from being able to do anything better yourself, even though it was just a mistake that you made. Also, domestic violence related offenses. This one, I could probably do multiple episodes just on domestic violence, but this is not this man or woman, goes both ways, has a history of just extreme violence. It's people get upset, they get heat in the moment. I've seen people get arrested for domestic violence because they pushed their partner or their spouse. No injury occurred, heat of the moment. I'm not advocating for anyone to put hands on anybody else, but things happen, especially when you're in those kind of settings. But you get charged and then possibly convicted with a domestic violence charge. Again, that's something that stays on your record forever and will hinder you. And to my knowledge, at least in the few states I've worked in, even just being charged with domestic violence can basically block you from certain jobs. So then that leads us into the next phase. So that's low level. Then we could focus on prison, and that's prison as we know it. Multiple offenses, felony offenses, rule violations, basically just choosing not to take the help or trying to not be a part of the program to be released back into society. You would then go to prison. Currently, this is how everybody gets treated, regardless of first-time offender. You got caught stealing something from local Walmart or something like that. They all get processed the same and housed in the same jails as, with somebody who just got done, stabbing somebody or shooting somebody or even murdering somebody. You're all housed together. And then when you get sentenced, if you get sentenced to over a year, which, and again, in certain states, if you get caught stealing 3, 4, 5 times, you could get a year, 2 year, 3 year sentence. You're in prison with murderers, drug dealers, gangbangers. You're all sentenced together. And I know there are a lot of jails that are trying rehabilitation programs. You can get, you can get your GED. There's even some college classes. It just kind of depends on the state you're in or where you're at. But again, I just don't see how somebody who has had a life of petty crime being housed and put in general population with somebody who's career criminal, which there just are some people who are addicted to the lifestyle or whatever the reasons might be, passion, heat of the moment. But I don't see how that's going to help you rehabilitate yourself and reacclimate back into society. Also, we could talk about prison sentences. So people who, a lot of talk has been talked about drug dealing. People who get caught, you're a 20-year-old kid, you get caught with a brick of cocaine, heroin, fentanyl is the new one right now, or pills, you could get a 25-year sentence. Again, it varies everywhere, so I'm just talking in generalities right now. I'm not going into individual or specific cases. This is a general conversation. But you come out of prison after 20, 25 years, and the world has left you behind. I remember when I was in Hillsborough County, guys would be getting out of prison for 20, 25 years. When they went in, cell phones were new, CDs, the internet, skill sets that involve anything on a computer, even POS systems, hotels, restaurants, things like that, where you pay with credit cards. That had all transpired while they were in prison. And a lot of guys and girls basically felt so out of touch with their neighbors and society, they would rather go back to jail. And some of them would violate their probation or parole because they're like, I can't live this way. So we're doing these individuals a disservice by not keeping them acclimated. Now, I have my own opinions on murderers, sex offenders, things of that nature. Some of the more prolific criminals that are out there, you should be in prison, and I don't feel sorry for you. Where I get caught up is, again, someone who's in a low-income neighborhood or just under dire straits, and they get caught up in the lifestyle of stealing or whatever it is, stealing a car, stealing their buddy's car. I know in Florida I used to work a lot of rob trades, so addicts who were addicted to whatever drug, for basically a hit or a piece would let the drug dealer use their car, and then the drug dealer just would never bring it back. And so now they can't go to work. They can't get these things done. These are people who, would get charged with false reporting. They'd get, which is a felony charge. They'd also get charged with any narcotics on them. To me, that's somebody who needs help, who needs to basically get removed from where they are at, taught a skill set, and then also get some mental health and some health issues addressed. Get drug rehab, alcohol rehab, whatever it is. That's my opinion. Then you can have maximum security prisons. And this is one area where I do kind of like the way Russia does it. Their maximum security prisons are typically staffed by the military. We could do something where retired veterans could work here, give them an opportunity to have a career after the military. But these are for the most heinous crimes. And this is where you're pretty much under almost 24-hour lockdown. It's punishment focused. You've committed an atrocity against your fellow man, and you should be punished, and you should be punished for life in these cases. Again, we're talking murder, severe heinous crimes, not just a one-off crime of passion, which, again, we could talk about that at another time because people get caught up with that as well. So now we'll transfer into the defund the police movement. And at the time when that was going on, I had a different mindset. A lot of agencies, and again, I fully understand both sides, actually. I understand law enforcement side. I understand civilian side. Law enforcement was circling the wagons. They just wanted to protect their agency, their men and women, and I fully understand that. I also understand the common citizen civilian was pissed off. They felt wronged. I don't think it helped that the media and politicians were just hammering it because, again, over 15 years in law enforcement, I've never seen an officer engage in any type of behavior simply because the individual was another race or gender or anything like that. It typically starts with some crime being committed, and then decisions get made. And depending on the coverage or the defense from your agency, those people their whole lives can get destroyed. So defunding the police, and my take is not defunding the police. I think that the police should have more training, more pay, but with more pay and more training comes more responsibility and also less calls for service. So many local law enforcement agencies respond to the most nonsense calls for service, noise complaints because their neighbor's playing the radio. Just the amount of things that a regular officer will go to is insane. Speaking from experience, when I was working with the Maine State Police, there was a call that I had to respond to, had been holding for like 8 hours. And it was two neighbors arguing because one neighbor felt the other one was growing strawberries on his property. And yes, I said strawberries. His strawberry patch had crept onto his property. And this call had been holding for most of the day. I didn't want to go to it. I had other things I was dealing with. But my sergeant was like, you're going to go to that call and you're going to handle it. So I'm driving. This is in Maine, so it took me like 2 hours to get to this address. I get there. There's two elderly gentlemen, and they were all fired up. They were ready to state their case. I got out and basically explained to them that they are adults. They need to figure this out for themselves. I don't deal with property. I don't deal with easements or assessments of somebody's property. And if there had issues, that was a civil issue. And to be tying up a state trooper or any local law enforcement agency because of strawberries when there are suicides, shootings, domestic violence, burglaries, robberies, traffic crashes happening around, and I had to stop what I was doing to go address these two adults to address a nuisance call is where it ended up being. To me, is just the most insane thing. That's not something that's not something a uniformed law enforcement officer should respond to. And this will tie into something later on, but this is where you could have social services, you could have a different, non-uniformed officer or somebody who's not in a law enforcement capacity address those types of calls. You don't need a state trooper or a deputy or a cop to respond to that. This would also help with better media interaction and understanding of cases, meaning the agency all have public officers or people who speak on behalf of the agency to the media. And that relationship at every level of law enforcement should be better. Fully admit that. But also, when we get these media outlets that are just bashing an agency or a cop's decision wrongly, they should be held accountable for false reporting. To me, that is one of the main things that is destroying communication between law enforcement and the citizens. So it's something that doesn't need to happen. It's embarrassing that it has been happening. And to give you an example of kind of a combination of this, I'll mention 3 large cases. One is the George Floyd case, national media news. Again, I'm not trying to dig into what actually transpired. My point is a uniformed officer, or officers in this case, had no reason to respond to that. George Floyd was trying to pass a $20 counterfeit note. I don't even know if it was counterfeit because we never heard anything about it. We only heard about the aftermath. But that is a misdemeanor, a very low level misdemeanor, which caused rioting, looting, took over the airwaves for weeks and months and destroyed the careers of 4 to 5 different officers. Again, this isn't me getting into what they did was right or wrong. I'm not breaking down any of that. I'm simply addressing the fact that they even responded to something like that. The next one is the case out of Atlanta. Again, I'm trying to just keep it general, but there was an individual passed out at a Wendy's, possibly a DUI. Who knows? Maybe he was having a medical emergency. Again, all of that kind of gets lost in the sauce when you talk about the aftermath. He ended up losing his life, or at least he was shot at. But anyway, why did the officers have to respond? That should have been an ambulance, social worker, what's going on? They could have assessed that. Again, even if it was a DUI, even if he was drunk, it's a misdemeanor. And yet half of Atlanta ended up burning. I mean, the riots that took place, the impact it had on Atlanta PD was tremendous. And again, over potentially a DUI. I don't even have clarity on whether or not it was a DUI. And the last one, and this is one I do know about because I was in law enforcement when this happened. I was in law enforcement for the other 2, but this was my introduction into law enforcement, was Eric Garner out of New York. And this one I actually did dig into back when it occurred because I just thought it was insane. Eric Garner ended up dying because he was selling loose cigarettes. And again, let me just also preface this. If you are committing a crime, just do what the cops tell you to do. If they're giving you lawful orders, if you feel like your rights are being violated, you can deal with that after the fact. There's no reason to engage in physical violence or a physical altercation with uniformed officers when you know you're doing something wrong. Or even if you disagree that, selling loose cigarettes isn't wrong, it's an ordinance. Fighting against cops, not the way to go. But a lot of times what got left out in the story was the mayor wanted these type of ordinances, this selling loose cigarettes, to be enforced. I've talked to many people in NYPD, some of them high-ranking officials. They said it was a direct order from the mayor. He didn't like it. He didn't like seeing it. He didn't want to hear about it. And so that was their task. They had to go round these people up who were selling loose cigarettes. Now, with that being said, Garner had been arrested or cited over 40 times. It might have been more than that for selling loose cigarettes. So again, it's something he felt didn't apply to him, didn't agree with it. Whatever it is, again, that's for something legislators, state, local legislators, national legislators. Officers enforce crimes and ordinances as they are instructed to. So even if Mr. Garner disagreed, doesn't mean he needs to get into a physical altercation when officers are trying to do their job and enforce an ordinance or a law. Again, these are 3 big cases, and again, it touches a lot of nerves on the law enforcement side, on the civilian side. These cases took over the airwaves, media. The coverage of all 3 were asinine, to say the least. Painted law enforcement in the worst possible depiction. But again, what are we responding to? Why are uniformed officers responding to that? Is there another way? So this is a question that I just have in general. There's some things that officers are just going to have to maintain. Traffic enforcement, not my bread and butter. Never really enjoyed it. Don't really care if you want to go 5, 10, 15 miles over the speed limit as long as you don't hit anybody. I don't really care. but it's something that you have to have rules of the road. Otherwise, people just drive like assholes. With that being said, I'm not a huge fan of red light cameras in general. And it's my example that I'm going to give ties into what could happen if we continue down this path. So when I was in London, I learned that London, one, has the most CCTVs, you're basically being recorded, but I think it has the most of any city in the world. But you can get arrested, cited for something that you were never caught doing based solely on video footage. What does that mean? What does that look like? When you're driving on the highways in London, there's so many cameras, and if you hit one camera and get to the next camera faster than you should have, you will get a ticket in the mail for speeding. If you get 3 tickets, they'll take your license. That is devastating if you're a driver in London. And this leads me to a kind of a slight bunny trail. Driver's licenses in other countries, everyone thinks it's a right in the U.S. It is not. Driving in the United States is a privilege. It's not a right. It's actually, and it's something very cheap. And again, I think it's important. But in other countries, like in Japan, it costs them $8,000 to get their driver's license. In London, I think it's something like $3,000 to get your driver's license. And they are extreme with their enforcement of traffic laws. If you get in a crash or if you do too much speeding, and I mean, if you get a DUI, it's a wrap. You basically can't get your license back. And it's a financial burden on the person driving. And it's also, but with that also being said, it's some of the safest roads you'll ever be on. Everyone goes the speed limit. There's very few crashes. There's hardly any DUIs that go on. And it's also a business because a lot of people can't afford $8,000, $3,000, whatever it is to drive. So it creates a side business. You just hire a driver. Something to think about. Next one is, how would you employ social services in conjunction with law enforcement? This is something I have thought a lot about. But homelessness, drug use, juvenile cases, I would even say some domestic violence cases. Domestic violence is such a broad term. Like I said, it could be something as minor in the broad scope of things as pushing somebody or slamming a door too hard. I mean, I've seen some crazy things with domestic violence, but it could also be, extreme abuse. So domestic violence is a whole episode. I'll probably do that at some other point. My brother was on here and talked about getting scratched and torn to pieces and bitten and had nails embedded in them. So there's extreme levels of domestic violence, but the more minor ones or the repetitive ones, that's something where a social service worker could assist in getting them treatment, counseling, therapy sessions, things of that nature. Homelessness is another huge cost and burden to local communities. I did a paper on this back when I was getting my undergrad in Nashville, Tennessee. The average cost of a homeless individual in that city was, at the time, $100,000. And that's because of the services that they require, interactions with law enforcement, hospitalizations, the list goes on. We don't do a good job across the country with dealing with the homeless crisis. And certain states have just basically said, hey, just come here and be homeless. We'll pay you to be homeless. We'll let you do drugs out in the open, mostly on the West Coast. That doesn't help them at all. You're just feeding into their issues, their drug use issues, or their mental health issues. Again, I don't have answers for all these things, but currently the way we're doing it is not helping. Juvenile cases are something that every law enforcement agency has to deal with. It's irritating. It's frustrating. It's sad. Again, juveniles commit the same types of crimes as adults. The difference being they're not adults, right? And I know that's kind of an oversimplification. But a lot of juveniles who steal, burglarize, commit more petty crimes, they get put on probation. And typically, the parents are never held accountable for making sure the juveniles adhere to their probation, be at home before 9 or whatever the rules might be. There's all kinds of rules for juveniles. And there has been a massive pushback of arresting parents who don't do that. But if you can't enforce the probation onto your child, then the state needs to figure out somewhere else that child can go so that they don't continue to commit crimes. It puts themselves in danger because they're out here committing crimes. And despite what people believe, you see a 14, 15-year-old male or female running around breaking into cars. The officer doesn't just know immediately, oh, that's a juvenile. Especially with some of the sizes of some of these individuals, they look like adults, which then puts them in a bad spot. But also, they're engaging with other criminals who are not there for their best interest. They get used a lot to commit crimes. I'm reminded of a case I worked in Hillsborough County where the retail theft, vehicle burglaries, and regular burglaries had gone through the roof. I mean, we see a spike of like almost 300% in the last 5 days. So we're like, what the hell's going on? And detectives were trying to figure it out. We're all trying to figure it out. I did a call. Large group of juveniles just basically ransacked Walmart and were last seen him on foot. I saw them. Instead of just jumping out and trying to grab them, I was trying to see where they were going. I tracked them back to an abandoned townhouse that was off a dirt road, which I didn't even know existed in my area, and got back up. We all went in. I think there was 10 or 12 juveniles in the home. 4 of them had warrants. They ranged in age from 11 to 17. There was one 18-year-old. And it was basically like a Lord of the Flies situation. They had power hooked up from an extension cord. Somebody had climbed a telephone pole, which I didn't even know you could do, and just plugged in. Didn't even know you could do that. And that's how they were running their TVs, air conditioning studios, stereos. They were all living in this Lord of the Flies situation. There was mountains of stolen goods. Several of the kids were missing. Their parents had reported them missing. 2 of them had escaped juvenile detention. So it was a mess. It was a mess. But this is what happens when you don't have a plan or don't have a good way to address juveniles who are criminals. So, and that leads me to my next story, because again, a lot of people hear juvenile and they're just like, oh, they're children. I can't believe you're doing this. How are they getting caught up in the judicial system? The youngest child that I ever arrested was 9 years old. And you ask, well, oh my God, 9 years old, what are you talking about? How could you arrest him? He was robbing people at gunpoint and also selling crack cocaine. Clearly, issue at home. That is correct. Both of his parents were in federal prison. I think he was living with his grandmother, who wasn't able to discipline the child or have any influence over this child. The case hit the local news, and I remember there was a citizen who just bashed Hillsborough County. We were monsters, and how dare we, he was so young. And she ended up adopting him. And we all tried to counsel her and say, ma'am, you don't understand. He needs to get help, professional help. He needs to go to a juvenile detention center. He needs actual real help. She wanted to hear none of it. 6 months later, she calls 911 because he had beaten her so bad that she ended up having to go to the hospital and had stolen a bunch of stuff from her home. Again, I'm not saying that this child was a lost cause, but releasing this individual back into the population because of pressure from the community served, 1, that lady no good, and 2, he ended up having to go to a juvenile detention center. Again, I'm just throwing this out there as a discussion, food for thought, so to speak, and we need to do a better job and be more efficient with our law enforcement assets. The amount of calls that officers go to, from mental health calls, people want to commit suicide, or actual, mental health, suicide calls are actual mental health calls, and they need help. But there's also people who have psychotic breaks, who have actual diagnoses for bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. I've seen people dig in their arm because they thought there was demons in there or bugs. There was a guy that we used to deal with probably every couple of weeks who would pop his eye out because he had to let the demon out. I'm not a mental health professional by any stretch of the imagination. And all we ended up doing is continue taking him to the same Baker Act facility in Florida, is what they call it, a Baker Act. It's where you take somebody to get mental health help for 3 days, and then they're typically released back onto the street. But law officers are usually the first people to engage or respond, but the follow-up also is something that we need to be better at. And that's where, again, instead of bashing social services or refusing to work for social services, has caused more issues than I think has solved. There needs to be a way that all agencies, police officers, fire departments, probation officers, social security workers that assist on elder abuse cases, child abuse cases, we need to do better at working with each other, filtering through criminal cases, and hey, this person needs help or this person's in a bad situation. And I think that all ties back into the overall purpose, direction of the United States Justice Department and being just punitive. Because when you're just punitive, it basically allows people who are suffering from drug addiction or mental health issues, psychotic breaks, to slip through the cracks. Children slip through the cracks. And it takes so much money, so much taxpayer dollars just to enforce the laws for the actual criminals who are out here engaged in criminal activity, that it basically there's no money left over for the people who could be well served with the services we discussed. I hope that this prompts conversation. Again, I'm not sitting here acting like I have all the answers. I just wanted to put this out there because it's something that's been on my mind. You saw it a lot in recent weeks because of the presidential election. You've got, the House and the Senate and local AGs, and there's got to be a better way than just trying to decriminalize everything and letting everybody run amok. We need to be better at ascertaining, hey, these are criminals. They need to go to prison or maximum security. These other people just need help. They need to be removed from the situation. They need to get clean. They need to learn a skill set, a trade, something of that nature. More time, energy, and resources should be pushed towards the first set, the low-level criminal. And I don't know. I'm going to keep pushing it. I talk about it to anybody who will listen. And so this is my podcast, so I'm going to keep talking about it. And if I do get any type of more up-to-date research, I will do a follow-up episode. But hopefully you enjoyed it, and I appreciate your time.